2011, you only were a non-drinker if you were an alcoholic, or you were pregnant, or you were driving, or a bit weird. That was it. You know, now people decide to not drink because they just want to be healthy and not have horrible anxiety and bad night's sleep. I think a lot of the things I wrote about and talked about in media interviews in the early years were very much about the female experience. A lot of women I speak to are very worried about telling anybody about their alcohol issue in case their children get taken into care. So I think that's another sort of uniquely female worry or concern that women who drink go through. I have felt angry at times, you know. I think I've got past the anger now. But I feel very concerned and aware when I see the manipulation tactics of big alcohol, because they're everywhere and they target young people, because once you've kind of got into that habit of drinking as a teenager, for most people, it sticks. It's there for most of your life. Yeah, I mean, I think the first one that is long overdue is to end the self-regulation of the alcohol industry. You know, that's bonkers. People will pay huge amounts for advertising and marketing because people are shaped, people are easily influenced, they can be conditioned, they can be manipulated. I think what we've got on Soberistas, which I hope will withstand the kind of, you know, the tidal wave of AI influence, is that real person community. It's not the stuff that's going to make somebody stop drinking if they're in the grip of an alcohol dependency. You're much more likely to get that from human connection, I think, from people who've been where you are now and who've come out the other side.
Hello and welcome to one of Alcohol Review's highly irregular video interviews. I'm delighted to say we have an opportunity to speak to somebody who's been a notable fixture in the alcohol harm space for over a decade. That's the whole time I've been looking into this topic, and probably a little bit more as well. We've been on somewhat parallel paths, but we've never actually met in person or online. She's a pioneering sobriety coach, author, and founder of the Soberistas online support group. So at very long last, hello and welcome, Lucy Rocca.
Hi.
Yeah, good to meet you after so long.
I know, nice to meet you.
I think I've gathered quite a lot over the years, but maybe some of our viewers and listeners won't have been following quite so closely. So could you just give us a bit of an introduction to how you sort of launched yourself into this area?
Yes. Okay. So I basically my training for this role was being a very chronic binge drinker for 22 years, which sort of landed me on the very, well, I was going to say an unfortunate night, but actually turned out to be the best night really ever, because it led me to the very wise decision to stop drinking. A night in April 2011, where I drank very large amounts and ended up in hospital. Woke up the next morning having no kind of clue where I was, and came to the conclusion that I basically needed to stop drinking. The landscape, as I'm sure you remember, that kind of time, 2011, was really different to what it is now in terms of support for anybody wanting to stop drinking. And I didn't fancy the AA route for various reasons. So about a year and a half after that night in April, I set up a website called Soberistas, which was designed to plug the gap really and provide help for people who might not identify as a sort of alcoholic in the stereotypical sense of the word. What has been termed now grey area drinkers. And yeah, then that was the sort of start of my new career really.
And what without sort of besmirching other people's approach to this, what did you find uncomfortable about the sort of recovery AA approach to the issue?
Well, I mean, I have to be honest. I was, you know, it was a prejudiced conclusion there that I drew, because I never actually went to AA. So I'd had this idea in my head that it was kind of very religious, and I'm not religious. I'm also not very good at following rules. I don't feel like I'm very good at kind of being told what to do. So the idea of like the 12-step thing didn't really appeal. But I think more than anything, the reason why I didn't go to AA was I was so full of shame and just totally sort of broken. I had no confidence. I was extremely, emotionally low after that drinking night that landed me in hospital. And the thought of going into a room full of strangers and sort of declaring myself an alcoholic just filled me with complete dread. And I didn't actually think I was an alcoholic, because my understanding of the word was that was somebody who was physically addicted to alcohol, and I just most definitely wasn't. I'd always described myself as this person with no off switch. So I just used to kind of drink and then be having a lovely time, and then next thing I knew, I'd be waking up in somebody's spare bed with a sick bucket next to the side. And I'd kind of just got really, really drunk and not been able to stop. But then I'd not drink in the day. I, had a decent job. I was running half marathons. I did a fast track law degree. Not the kind of stereotype of the person whose life is falling apart because of alcohol. So that kind of terminology around addiction, alcoholic, recovery just didn't kind of fit for where I was.
Mm-hmm. I think people who go down that AA path, and once they've achieved sobriety, they consider themselves still part of an identity, a recovery identity. Is there a replacement for that in your sort of scheme of things?
I mean, we've Soberistas has been running now for 13 years, and we've got some people on Soberistas who've been there for the whole time, and they got sober in the first year or two of their membership to Soberistas, and they've been sober ever since, but they stay on the site so that they, I guess, stay in touch. They're in contact with other people who share their view on alcohol in a world that is very, alcoholic, very sort of, that normalizes alcohol everywhere. So I think there is our version of that, I guess, is just kind of being in touch with people who enjoy not drinking, who celebrate their sobriety, and who find it challenging, I guess, living in a world that celebrates alcohol so wildly and glamorously and all the rest of it, because it's, sometimes it can feel a bit of a lonely place to not drink when we live in this society.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that things have changed over that period. What has it become easier? Has it become harder, or
I think it's become easier. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's my view. I haven't actually gone through it. So, it was hell on earth when I stopped drinking in 2011. I didn't want to go to AA. I didn't want to talk to anybody at all about my alcohol issues or my sobriety. I would never ever have dreamt of speaking to like a sober coach or anything like that. I mean, I just didn't want to talk to anybody. I sort of locked myself in my bedroom and cried for about a year and was a hermit, and that was it. Eventually I kind of came out the other side and things got much better, thankfully. But now, yeah, I mean, gosh, you look in the supermarket, there's like this whole section of like really exciting alcohol-free drinks. There's millions of sober influencers and sober coaches online. You can buy all these different books that are like really inspirational, and just normal people normalizing sobriety. It's not this penance that perhaps we thought it was 10, 15 years ago. And I certainly looked at it like that because I was conditioned by a very different society, I suppose. In 2011, you only were a non-drinker if you were an alcoholic, or you were pregnant, or you were driving, or a bit weird. That was it. Now people decide to not drink because they just want to be healthy and not have horrible anxiety and bad night's sleep. It's a very different kind of, the stigma has been broken a lot, I think, by the online presence of the sober community, I guess.
Yeah, I can certainly testify to that. I gave up, not permanently, but for 5 years or something, around the time I wrote my book, and I continued for a little bit longer just because it felt like a good thing to do. But I do now drink occasionally, but I was out a few times, and I was the only one drinking, which, so the boot is on the other foot. I've gone from one minority to another. So I certainly wasn't advocating my choices, but it was very very strange to having been on both sides of the fence.
I bet.
A lot of your work is primarily focused at women. I think that's fair to say. Do women face particular sort of challenges in this regard?
Yes, but I mean, I would say equally, I think men face particular challenges too. It's just that I am a woman, and so my sort of Soberistas and everything I've done since then stemmed from my writing, really, which was kind of me processing all the horrible stuff that happened because of alcohol in my life. And I think a lot of the things I wrote about and talked about in media interviews in the early years were very much about the female experience. So the sort of the shame of being a drinker when you're a mum, for instance, and this sort of society's representation of what being a mother is, you know, this kind of nurturing, caring, all sort of, you know, kind of selfless person. And then you're kind of drinking yourself into oblivion several nights a week and having terrible hangovers and being really snappy with your kids and not conforming to that kind of representation. There's a certain level of shame there, I think, that women feel that men perhaps don't in that respect. And I think a lot of women I speak to are very worried about telling anybody about their alcohol issue in case their children get taken into care. So I think that's another sort of uniquely female worry or concern that women who drink go through. But also, it's a confusing place to be a female binge drinker, perhaps in this time in the world's history, because we were told very clearly in the 1990s through popular culture that being a kind of ladette and necking pints and being one of the boys, etc., was really cool and really positive and definitely the thing that you should be doing. And loads of us embraced that with gusto when we were at university and in our 20s and 30s. And then you sort of hit late 30s, perimenopause, hormone shifts. Suddenly that relationship with alcohol is very different and your body can't cope with it anymore. And society's telling you, you know, you shouldn't really be doing this because you're an adult woman now, grow up, and it's not really the done thing. But you can't stop because you're in this dependent cycle with alcohol. So it's sort of we got taught that alcohol was very positive. And that was a very relatively new thing, I think, for women, because men have always been kind of given permission to drink, whereas women, it was a little bit later in the sort of 1990s that really started. So yeah, a few peculiarly female experiences, I would say.
Yeah, that liberation theme, I think it's picked up in a few areas in smoking, sort of the torches of freedom. And I think, like you, I always think, well, it clearly applies to women. It's very visible the way that women were encouraged to smoke when maybe they weren't smoking, and drink maybe when they weren't drinking quite so much. But in a way, that message had already been successfully transmitted to men maybe a few decades or maybe a century before. How do you process that idea of drinking as a liberation, as a liberating experience?
Sort of now, do you mean at this point, or? Yeah,
I mean, I think it does create a genuine sort of dissonance in your head. Where, on the one hand, it does seem like you can kind of you're given liberty to behave maybe in a way that one wouldn't ordinarily. So that in a way is liberating, but at the same time, I guess there are other things which are less liberating about it. I'm just wondering how to square those two things.
I guess, I mean, there are a few things there. I think when it's happening, when I was in the middle of it, when I was kind of late teens, early 20s, I had very little sort of self-awareness. It's funny now, I mean, I did a media studies degree, so I did loads of stuff about marketing and, manipulation and PR and stuff, but it never really occurred to me that when I was buying into all of that stuff, the Boddingtons, Melanie Sykes advertising the Boddingtons beer, and I was just kind of sold on that. I just thought that was the coolest thing ever, and it never occurred to me that I was being manipulated in that way. And I was struggling with a lot of things, low self-confidence, undiagnosed ADHD, trauma, all sorts of things that actually now when I look back, I was self-medicating with alcohol, but at the time I never questioned it because I was surrounded by cultural reference points, basically saying that what I was doing was cool. So it's only now when I look back from the age of 50 and a completely different self-identity, and that I can see what was going on. Now I feel quite, I have felt angry at times, I think I've got past the anger now. But I feel very concerned and aware when I see the manipulation tactics of big alcohol, because they're everywhere and they target young people, because once you've kind of got into that habit of drinking as a teenager, for most people, it sticks. It's there for most of your life, so it's a very powerful easy way of manipulating people and getting them into that kind of drinking culture at an early age now with social media. And that, it concerns me, because it was a trap that I really struggled to get out of. And I see a lot of, thousands and thousands of women on Soberistas who have similarly struggled to get out of that trap.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I think probably most people of our sort of vintage or similar probably never really socialized, without alcohol. Pretty much happens simultaneously. You start actually emerging from, childhood, and then immediately you've got a pint in your hand, and that's your key. That is your key to the social world. Which I don't know whether that's true. I don't know whether you have people in your life who have a different experience. I don't know whether that sort of fundamental association is still there, but
it's different. I think I've got a almost 14-year-old daughter and a 27-year-old daughter, and they're different. Their experiences of alcohol have been really different to ours. When I think back to the 1980s, God, like every person in my year either smoked, drank, probably half of them took illegal drugs. We were just total hedonists in the late 80s, early 90s, and they're not like that at all. They're quite square, thankfully.
Right. Yeah. And I guess it's socializing other way. I mean, this is sort of going slightly off topic, but I mean, you need a vehicle to be sociable and interact. I mean, what do they? I don't have such people in my life. So how do they do it without sort of hanging around in a pub?
Well, I mean, it's a weird world, isn't it? These kids are all on their phones, the devices. They've got their Snapchat, TikTok, weird things that I don't engage in. I mean, both my daughters are quite they're a lot more switched on, like emotionally and health conscious, mentally health conscious and physically health conscious. My 14-year-old, she likes to go to the gym with me. She does hang out with her friends, but she does a lot of it online. They play games together still. They like to go shopping. She likes the cinema, things like that. But she's a lot more, a lot less self-destructive, I would say, than that. I was kind of on a mission from the age of 13, 14 onwards.
Yeah. I always think that drinking and the sort of culture around it, if we want to call it culture, is a lot about playing and being, having license to be a bit silly and lose your inhibitions.
Yeah.
And these days there are just a million ways to do that, and maybe not in person, but over the internet, and memes, and I mean, people are being silly sort of 24/7 if you want that.
There's an expression there, isn't there, through social media that we didn't have, I guess. Yeah.
I think it was more or less a kind of Brownian motion. You kind of just wander around and hope to bump into people like minds, in a very sort of simple, way. So, yeah. And do you think that people who have, lived experience or have direct experience have something to offer, the discussion, which maybe people who haven't had sort of negative experiences around alcohol can't contribute?
Yes, I do, because the alcohol industry would have us all, I think, are quite happy that we all have this impression. When I say the alcohol industry, I'm talking about big alcohol. I'm talking about, the kind of Diageo and of the world. And I think they like the fact that there is this kind of narrative that there are alcoholics, this sort of small minority of people who can't control themselves over here, and then the rest of us are all sort of responsible drinkers. And it suits to maintain that narrative, and I don't buy that. I think the vast majority of people who drink are on the spectrum of alcohol use disorder somewhere, and they may be low down that alcohol use disorder spectrum, or they might be right at the top, but they're on a spectrum. And a lot of the reasons why people end up higher up the spectrum, things like neurodivergence, I've really realized in the last year since having that diagnosis that a huge amount of my drinking was about self-medicating undiagnosed ADHD. I had no idea I had ADHD, and it's so obvious now that I'm kind of on medication, and I have an ADHD therapist who I've been seeing, and so much of my behavior and history was about trying to manage undiagnosed ADHD, and alcohol is beautiful for that. It works a treat, shuts down the overthinking. It's a way of kind of dealing with the anxiety and the depression, the masking, all sorts of kind of things. That alcohol just fits that gap beautifully. And there's loads and loads of people who are neurodivergent. So I think there's this great untapped sort of research area that we need to look into as to, you know, the links between neurodivergence and alcohol use. And I think a lot of people on that spectrum are probably neurodivergent. But there's also people who have had traumas, you know, whether that's childhood traumas or traumas throughout adult life, like divorce and redundancy and bereavement. And for all of these reasons, alcohol is the perfect, you know, emotional anesthetic, isn't it? You know, I drank all the way through my divorce. That was when my drinking reached its peak. I was just getting, all my girlfriends would come round, slagging him off, packet of fags, bottle of wine. Come on, let's get pissed and slag off, you know, slag him off. And it was what you did. And so when I came out, by the time sort of I got through that initial divorce thing, I was stuck in this habit of 1-2 bottles of wine a night. And, you know, that was my kind of coping mechanism. So I think that's the reason really why a lot of people have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. We get into the habit of drinking and then life throws these curveballs at us. We might even just be a bit shy or an introvert, and it gives us that social lubrication because we find socializing awkward and difficult. So there's lots of reasons when we think compassionately about it, why somebody might rely unhealthily on alcohol and get into a mess with it. But as long as we keep being told that story by the alcohol industry that it's either alcoholics or responsible drinkers, there's this kind of self-blame that you go through. There's this feeling of I'm weak, or there's something wrong with me because I can't stop drinking when other people can. And I just don't buy that. I think there's bigger reasons for it. And I think if we look at it through a compassionate lens, it's about people self-medicating essentially with a very widely available cheap drug.
Yeah. It's something I wrote a book very much sort of narrowly focused on sort of individual experiences. You probably know I'm sort of now looking more at the sort of broader environmental factors. But I mean, alcohol was a medicine. I mean, it was considered a medicine for hundreds of years. It was, you know, given to people to, you know, I don't suppose initially summon the spirits or calm the humours, and I think maybe when we look at advertising, it doesn't directly say it's going to treat this disease, but it shows somebody having a good time. So if you're not having a good time, or you're not happy, then you think, well, look at this person, they're happy. So you know, you fill in the gaps. What's doing that, and this product does that. So it's sort of a utility value, which is sort of implied by the imagery.
Definitely, and it feels like it's doing the job, doesn't it? When you're drinking socially, if you are a bit introvert or shy, you know, it feels like, oh, this is good, this is like what I need, because suddenly I can talk to people and I'm not full of kind of awkwardness and it's not all horrible. So you can tell that it instantly kind of makes life feel easy in those moments, but obviously then it brings with it all its horrible consequences.
Yeah, I think, well, as we said before, that if you start socializing only with alcohol, then you never learn to do it without, and it's a skill you never develop. You know, it's just, or at least you develop it only in a particular sort of sedated state. So, you know, you can't expect miracles. So, I mean, I don't know whether you had the same experience, but, you know, learning to sort of be sociable and enjoy being sociable was a bit of a journey in itself. It doesn't necessarily happen automatically.
Huge journey. Yeah,
I mean, would you say you know, that the environmental factors you mentioned, I mean, you know, obviously we can learn to cope with them or identify them, and you mentioned advertising. You know, other things that can be done, or, you know, should we, you know, as a society be looking at solutions other than, you know, awareness of the risks?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one that is long overdue is to end the self-regulation of the alcohol industry. You know, that's bonkers to have people who are benefiting directly from the, you know, profits, the harms of alcohol because, you know, of the huge profit margins in alcohol, to be regulating their own practices is bonkers. So I think that first and foremost, there should be a neutral body to regulate the practices of the alcohol industry, and that needs to be done ASAP. I'm a big believer in minimum unit pricing. I don't buy into this idea that it doesn't work and it's just penalising, you know, the kind of wine drinkers. That's nonsense. I think all of the evidence is absolutely clear. Ireland, Scotland, you know, all of the places that have introduced minimum unit pricing, there's been a really marked reduction in alcohol-related deaths and health harms in the time that they've been practicing that. So that needs doing. Lobbyists, I think lobbying in the UK is, or certainly in England, is a very, very powerful, unregulated, under the radar practice that carries huge weight. And yeah, I think that needs to be far more kind of regulated and people held to account. So I think there's several things, but I think the biggest thing probably when you look at smoking and the, you know, the kind of product placement, the pricing, the promotion, the placement of those, of cigarettes, how they're now hidden behind screens, they're prohibitively expensive, they've got horrible pictures of lung cancer on the packets, etc. That works. You know, I used to smoke. I smoked for 20 years. As soon as they banned it in public places, as soon as it started ramping up in price, as soon as they started sticking those pictures of tumours on the packets, I was like, I don't want to do that anymore. And it's quite surprising to see somebody smoke these days in where I live. Certainly, I'm always kind of a bit, ooh, smoker over there. That's unusual. But, you know, when we were kids, when we were 20, everybody smoked. So it works. You put practices like that in place, it works. People start questioning their behaviour. They start making healthier choices. They get nudged towards healthier behaviours. But they'll only do that if the environment is changed. And the environment will only change if the government stops accepting backhanders and lobbying tactics behind the scenes. They need to hold the alcohol industry accountable, really, for their practices.
It's really interesting. I think often, you know, people who are in, you know, I suppose dealing with the consequences of alcohol harm aren't necessarily involved in the discussion around, you know, how those harms sort of came to be in terms of the environment we live in, these sort of political things. Do you think there's a way that you know, people sort of downstream can sort of get more involved in the upstream discussion? Because they're kind of separate in time, but they're actually just part of the same process.
Yeah, I mean, yes, again, but I think it would need government action in order for that to happen, because it is very separate, and we do see this very sort of this kind of cherry-picked representation of alcohol across society, don't we? That I talk about it a lot with my clients, but you see, for instance, like watching Netflix, you know, you just kind of any program on Netflix, pretty much, you're going to see there'll be some character who's drinking a huge glass of red wine or, you know, beer continually, and they've got beautiful skin and they're really slim and they're like, their relationships are all happy, and, you know, and you kind of look at them and think, that's not what you would look like if you were drinking that every night. Guaranteed, that's not what people look like when they're drinking to excess. But so to sort of question it and to join the dots and to make the connection between alcohol and alcohol related harms is really difficult, because we're just completely getting, you know, we're getting this different message all the time. So I think there needs to be some positive sort of action there to kind of help people see that, to understand that, whether that's, you know, through education, through kind of government health education messaging, or sort of focus groups, or I don't know, there's a conversation there that just doesn't happen, and everybody goes along with this kind of fantasy, I think, that it's actually okay. We don't want to join the dots and sort of know that actually alcohol is quite harmful.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose as an individual, I mean, I've got the same sort of separation of what I've done. I wrote a book about sort of you and alcohol, kind of and it was about pretty much individual experience of alcohol and how it affects you and sort of what you might be able to do about it and rethink it. And then there's this sort of wider world in which you're talking about laws which apply to everybody, and yeah, what am I getting at is that you know, they're part of the same thing, but you know, by having a changing an environment, it makes it easier to make these decisions which are better for you. You're kind of enabling people to make better choices.
Yeah, it makes a bit more sense, doesn't it? If you if you see the government taking action, let's say they just put that sort of skull and crossbones little sign in the corner of every wine bottle, for instance, this is a toxic substance that causes 7 different types of cancer. If you see that, and then, you know, there's less of that product placement going on, and there's less sort of trivializing or glamorizing of alcohol in sort of advertisements or on TV or on greetings cards, you suddenly, you know, start your perception of it starts to shift. You might start to question it and think, oh, but we don't get that. We get these beautiful bottles with the pretty labels, and the sort of shop front, if you like, of alcohol is all very appealing. You have to dig a bit deeper and do it yourself and go behind that in order to find out the truth. It's not readily available. And the only way it's going to become readily available is if the government starts to take proactive steps towards informing people about the actual health harms of alcohol. And they won't do that at the moment because of lobbyists.
Yeah. I suppose it's, I'm trying to, it's kind of like help me help myself, or help us help ourselves. So you're acknowledging the fact there is a personal agency involved in decisions to purchase and consume products, but you're obviously also saying there is agency involved in where you sell them, how you sell them, which can make that process more easy.
Yeah. We need, and some people are more easily influenced than others. So, you know, like I was saying before about neurodivergence or trauma, or just going through, you know, a really tough chapter of your life. If you're very, very lonely, you've just got divorced, you know, your self-worth is on the floor, you may be feeling very bleak about the future, and then you're kind of wandering into a shop and seeing all this, you know, nice, cheap display of booze. It's not going to take a genius to work out that that's going to be quite tempting to sink. Whereas, you know, so we can't assume, and we absolutely shouldn't assume, that human beings are always coming from a place of optimized emotional resilience and the agency it requires to make the best choices. We're absolutely not. We're all struggling with something at some point in our life, and alcohol is very much there as the obvious emotional anesthetic.
Yeah, I worked briefly, to my shame, as in an advertising agency. It wasn't sort of hands-on advertising or anything, but I did speak to people who were. And I remember one guy, one of the sort of managers there, was explaining to me how we should look at the audiences that were, you know, delivering these millions of impacts of these ads on as sheep, essentially, who were being sort of guided through a gate. I mean, literally dehumanizing view.
Oh,
I mean, they're not all bad people, but this is what they're doing. They're trying to shoo people through a gate, and they don't really care how it happens. That's not their worry, you know.
And the other thing is, you know, how much money is invested into that kind of marketing and advertising is billions. You know, it's a highly, you know, lucrative industry because it works. It gets results. You know, people will pay huge amounts for advertising and marketing because people are shaped, people are easily influenced, they can be conditioned, they can be manipulated. And like you said, the free torch of freedom, the smoking thing in the 1920s or 30s, I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah, like the women in New York on the floats, all smoking away, and within a year, women, the level of smoking amongst women in the States had just gone through, you know, stratospheric. It was just, it had gone through the roof, purely because of that. It works. We're influenced by marketing.
Yeah, I think the industry, I mean, I bring this up fairly often, you might have seen, but, you know, the industry will say, oh, well, this is just, we're investing to, you know, one branded lager versus another branded lager, and they're just sort of, there's a zero-sum game. They're just competing with each other. But the thing is, my contention would be that you're actually investing all this money in this thing called alcohol, which is then competing against a thing called going out doing sport or going out to the theatre or going to to some other recreational activity. It's so en masse you're creating a competitive force against other consumer choices. To put it. You can't.
That as well, that those activities you've mentioned there, the theatre and sport, have been hijacked by the alcohol industry as well. So if you look at kind of all of the major sporting events, they're all sponsored by alcohol. the theatre, when I go to the theatre and I might book tickets online, you know, the next thing that comes up is, would you like to pre-order your drinks for the interval? You know, you're like, I don't want to have a drink. I'm going to the theatre because I don't drink and I want to enjoy a night away from the pub. And now you're like, you know, I've got this kind of nice offer of Prosecco or whatever at the interval. So it's hijacked. Even these kind of activities that really should have nothing to do with alcohol have been hijacked by the alcohol industry.
It could well be my association there was influenced by the alcohol industry in mentioning those particular things. So you know, nobody can escape the power of marketing. You're talking about the sort of dystopian world, and I, as you may have seen, I'm running an event on AI in alcohol harm and what have you. I don't want to put you into, you know, maybe it's not a topic you're that interested in, but still, you run an online forum where people, you know, real people are helping real people, you know, deal with their issues. I wondered whether, you know, you can see a part that you know, I don't know, an AI helper or somebody, a bot or whatever, could sort of answer questions when they'll be there, or, you know, do you see any positivity, or is it, you know, is there a kind of the risks outweigh any?
Well, I mean,
benefits?
it's already happening, isn't it? In lots of, like, I periodically sign up to sort of different apps for like health things, you know, like I don't know, weight loss or fitness things or whatever. And those kind of online coaches, those bot coaches, are already a very big thing on lots of apps. I think what we've got on Soberistas, which I hope will withstand the kind of, you know, the tidal wave of AI influence, is that real person community, the connection that you get from talking to a human being who's been through the mill, whose soul you feel connected to because you've got this shared pain. And I don't think, well, I know you can't get that from AI. So I hope that that kind of ends up being what is our, you know, what keeps us safe from this kind of encroaching AI world, and makes us kind of stand out, because there is a difference, you know, in terms, you can pick up those little tips about how to get through the first month or the first year of your sobriety or whatever. You can get that from ChatGPT or whatever, but like little kind of practical tips. But the power that comes from talking to a human being who has cried, you know, weeks and weeks, and felt the deep levels of shame, and whose relationships have broken down, and they've looked in the mirror and hated what they see, and, you know, all of that like deep pain that comes from a struggle with alcohol. You see that, and you get that from connecting with somebody in a community like Soberistas. And I think for me, that's the healing, that's the power of the healing, you know, that's where that comes from, is the realization that it's not just you, you're not a flawed human, you are just the same as all these other people who've been through the same stuff, and that together you can kind of grow stronger and get a lot of solidarity and healing out of that. So I think there is a place perhaps for both, but I would say the AI bit is light touch, and it's not the stuff that's groundbreaking. It's not the stuff that's going to make somebody stop drinking if they're in the grip of an alcohol dependency. You're much more likely to get that from human connection, I think, from people who've been where you are now and who've come out the other side.
And just to sort of wrap up, we've probably talked for about 40 minutes or so, but just to look back on the whole experience, I think 14 years or thereabouts since you you know, underwent your own struggle with alcohol, and the experiences that have come after. I mean, overall, would you say it has been a positive experience, or you know, has it added to your life or taken away?
Well, yes. I mean, one of my philosophies, I suppose, is that I just try very hard not to regret anything that I've done in my life, because I think we're on this continual path of learning and growth, and good things come from struggles. You know, we get this sense of gratitude and understanding what really matters in life, I think, when we've been through hardship and really major struggles. So the best thing that ever happened to me was waking up in that hospital covered in my own congealed vomit and not knowing where on earth I was. You know, it really was the best thing that could have happened, because I think if that hadn't have happened, I probably wouldn't be here now. That put me on a completely different trajectory, and from that place, I've found myself. I've become sort of my most authentic self, I would say. I've got the best, most honest relationships with my family and friends. I've got my self-respect. I love my life on a daily, pretty much a daily basis, even when I'm going through hard times, because I value it. So yeah, I mean, I definitely don't regret it. It was a hard first half of my adult life, definitely, but what's come after it, I would say, has made it all worthwhile.
Well, that's a wonderful place to finish. Thank you very much for catching up after all this time. And I can't really call it catching up, but crossing paths after all this time. It's been a great pleasure.
Oh, it's been lovely. Thank you for having me.